And we are live!
Hello.
Hello, and welcome to the Story Engine Deck Workshop Series. The workshop series wherein we bring in different creative professionals from different disciplines to talk about passion areas of them, share their expertise, and then we do live creative prompts where you get to see the creative process of a particular expert live in front of you and pick their brains and ask questions and learn how they operate. So we had a little bit of a change of plan today. Originally, on our docket, we had Chef Shane Chartrand, who is a Top Chef competitor in Top Chef Canada. And I'm seeing Eric is dealing with some tech issues. Let me know if I can help you with anything there, bud. Um, but he actually fell very suddenly sick this morning. We had confirmed yesterday. We did like a pre-interview call with him yesterday. Everything was looking really good. But yeah, sudden illness, and he's had to bow out. So unfortunately, we won't be joined by Chef Shane today. But we realized that we have an expert on food and the culture of food and how food fits into world building in-house. And I was really excited to ask if Miroki would be able to fill in, because so many of the really deep questions that we'd prepared to ask Chef Shane about food and culture and world building were questions that Miroki came up with, or that I came up with after listening to Miroki's interview of Chef Shane on her podcast, Tasting Together. Because if you don't know already, Miroki is a writer and podcaster about food, widely traveled, food and drink, covers all aspects of it. So I was really excited to be able to sort of rewrite some of the questions that we had planned, rewrite some of the prompts to be able to do a session with her. And then we do hope to have Chef Shane on in the future. We're going to have to figure out how and when we can do that, just because we know that he's really busy and we pre-set out the live stream schedule, but we really want to have him in, and we are saving some of the questions that we'd written for him. So we should have that opportunity in the future. Stay tuned to the Story Engine newsletter for more on that. But in the meantime, let me announce our very special guest, and you might learn some things about Miroki that you have not learned yet. A passionate enthusiast of all things wine and food, Miroki Tong has tasted her way all around the world, learning from winemakers, chefs, experts, and fellow enthusiasts, always eager to talk with someone who shares in her love of food and drink. You can find her on Instagram at 9 ounces please. As well as the co-host of the podcast Tasting Together, which explores the food and drink scene with some of the best chefs, mixologists, and restaurateurs in Canada and globally. When not sipping, learning, and educating about vino, Miroki is the CEO of the Story Engine Deck. She holds an MBA with specializations in strategic management, organizational behavior, and entrepreneurship. She is also an award-winning performer, producer, and musician, currently working on an upcoming opera metal EP under her artist name Mahjong Witch. She has 2 singles, Until the Last Planet Dies and The Edge of Life, released on Spotify, Apple Music, and other major streaming platforms. Please join me in welcoming our special guest, Miroki Tong! Yay! Normally we bring people from backstage and their camera's a separate camera, but we made Miroki hide off screen.
Yeah, like there was like there's not normally this much negative space when we do these live streams.
I was really hoping for like some sort of magic summoning.
It would be very cool if we had that technology, but alas, we're still working on the magic summoning powers.
Yeah, and I want to say how sad I am that Chef Shane isn't joining us. I mean, we literally spoke to the guy yesterday, and he was so excited to join. We kind of ran him through some of the things we wanted to ask him about, and he came up with new concepts and ideas that he wanted to discuss, that he really wanted to share. So for him to fall ill, I think I got a message from him in the morning asking for the time, and I actually get a sense that the reason why he did is because I think he was already ill, as his assistant seemed to allude to, and that he was trying to recover in time for the live stream. But I think
we got an email that he might not be discharged in time.
Yeah.
So that's
seems like a very ominous thing. So we, sending all our best regards to Chef Shane and his recovery, and hopefully we'll have a chance for him to join us. And I will do my best to honor his space. There will be no talks about Indigenous and First Nations cuisine other than like any sort of reference to any of the podcasts I've ever interviewed with Indigenous chefs, which I have done before, but I will not claim ever to be an expert on Indigenous cooking whatsoever. But hopefully I'll be able to bring my expertise on a lot of other subjects, because talking about food is, something I'm very passionate about. Heck, there's a reason why I have a podcast called Tasting Together, which talks, not only about wine, but about cuisine, culture, about decolonizing cuisine is actually a term we'd still use whether it's around ethnic food, I guess, so to say, international and global cuisine, because there is a colonization of a lot of immigrant and international cuisine or food that immigrants bring back. So, hopefully we'll be able to dive into things. And if people have questions about any food stuff, I will be more than happy to share ad nauseum.
Speaking of which, this is the first call for questions. If you have any questions for Miroki about food culture and world building, or just about food and her experiences traveling the world and tasting different foods, and especially a lot of wines, please put those in the chat and we'll be sure to ask those. But in the meantime, to kick things off, this is something that I actually don't think I have heard you talk about before, which is what your path was to becoming not just someone who loves food, but actually becoming a food and wine writer and podcaster.
Well, I think I've always had a passion for, I like discovering and I like exploring, and I don't think it extends past food and drink. I don't tend to do anything halfway. I'm a maximalist in every way, shape, and form. I remember at one point in my life, I got really into gel pens, and my desire to get into gel pens meant buying every single gel pen I could ever see in the market and owning hundreds and hundreds of gel pens. No real reason. I just needed to be the one to have them all. So there's a really good reason why I probably don't collect cards and stuff like that anymore, because my brief Pokemon spell was very hard, fast, and dangerous. But I think there is a curiosity, and maybe that curiosity stemmed from the fact that I always knew that the food I experienced growing up was different than the traditional Canadian child, right? Like I would bring dishes to school, a lot of it like glutinous lotus wrapped rice or rice dishes. My parents packed everything in thermoses. And that's one thing I would like to bring up today is even just like the carrying of like how our food and how people interpret and judge other people based on how even you bring your food into a public space. But I remember bringing this food to school and kids would literally look at me and be like, ew, like, what is that? Ew, what is that? And I didn't really know how to explain it to people because, of course I'm like 6, 7. And I was ESL. Like I actually grew up. I didn't really speak English fluently until I was nearly 10. Despite being born in Canada, my parents raised me quite Chinese. And I didn't really know how to explain to people that this was just my food. So it was one of those things that I think for me, I found a novelty exploring North American cuisine because I'd read these children's books that are obviously geared towards North American Canadian white children. And they're eating like spaghetti and French fries, or they're, things are packed, they're going on picnics. And I'm like, what's a picnic? So I always found the novelty in these everyday occurrences. And I think that kind of started teaching me an appreciation for different cultures as I grew up. And then I would say, I think like I've had the privilege of traveling a lot around the world from teenager all the way to adulthood. And so you start experiencing a lot of local cuisines. I think at some point I got into tea quite in depth. I think, and that was a little bit kind of imposed upon me by my family and my uncle, who's very traditional and teaching us a lot of things about the culture, and tea is very much like the art of tea is very much a deep cultural thing. So, if it wasn't tea, it was coffee. And if it wasn't coffee, it was wine. And of course, wine is something that you technically shouldn't really enjoy until you reach age of majority. But I actually didn't get into wine first. I got into beer first, like all people, we got into a sweet sugary drink, the sweetest thing that tastes like not like alcohol. And then I actually turned 19 in Northern Ireland, and when I lived in Northern Ireland, you couldn't really afford mixed drinks. They were quite expensive, so you had to learn very fast to drink things like beer. And that's where I sort of learned to drink beer almost by necessity, so that I wouldn't, I was like a poor student at the time. I got my exposure into Scotch by backpacking through Scotland shortly afterwards, where suddenly these beverages were, you go from scotch being quite a premium beverage, it's quite expensive to get, to suddenly being like, look, a free sample. And I was like, of course, I wanted to try this. Wine came a lot long after that, like about a year later. I literally just one day decided, I think I'm going to get into wine now. I think that's literally my thought. I was like, I think I'm going to now learn about wine.
It's very, I should buy a boat. It's like, it's very, today's the day.
I think it's one of those when you see it, right? Like you often go into stores and you can see rows and rows and rows, like bottles and bottles and bottles of wine. So you go, well, surely there's more to it than just drinking the stuff, right? And I actually remember sitting in my room with a glass of yellowtail, swirling it and just kind of smelling it and trying to say, like, what does this smell like? What does this taste like? And it was probably the first moment where you start learning a lot about yourself as in terms of like your sensory understanding, because, you guys, if you guys haven't tried this before, like sometimes connecting your different senses together to the product, it's hard. You see it on, food competition shows where they'll blindfold chefs and tell them to smell and taste something and they say, guess it. And so many people get it wrong because it's actually really hard to kind of connect, like without sight or without smell or without taste, what you can lose or don't lose. And I actually, if you bring that into a storytelling perspective, imagine like, how does that affect people? Imagine if you had a character who's blind, how that affects their understanding of food and taste. Because I can tell you, when I was smelling that wine, I had all these senses that were familiar, but could I tell you it was blueberry? Could I tell you it was cherry? No, because I didn't have the cherry in front of me. And that was actually something I had to hone, a skill set I had to hone, tasting again and again and again, what it was all about. But I can see, like, as I'm talking about this is why it's so important for us to have like a really strong understanding of how we experience things like food and culture, because those things can really impact how you design an accurate and robust character.
Yeah, I think actually I'm going to throw a little, we don't always throw questions to the chat in these, but I think this is an interesting question that I want to throw to the chat, just thinking about, again, those very personal experiences of food and palate. If you would be so kind, chat, let us know where you're joining us from, and then also let us know what kind of foods you grew up with. I'd just be curious to know,
I would love to hear that.
Yeah, what your food experiences are like, just as a bit of a backgrounder for us. And we had some great questions in the chat already that we're going to answer at the end of the question segment. Some really, really fun ones. So thank you for those. I'm already excited and I can feel thoughts pinging there. So we titled this episode "World Building Food Culture." I know that's something that all three of us have had a chance to chat about, in the days leading up to this live stream. So could you talk a little bit about what food culture is and what it means besides just like what is on the plate within a culture, like all the different parts of culture that it connects to, I guess?
Oh, that's like a really loaded question, because food culture, I know when we first built this, I think there was obviously a really deep tie into Chef Shane's indigenous roots. So obviously there's a cultural element. So like we can talk about culture as in the culture of who we are as human beings, right? So we, I'm Chinese Canadian. I want to say that specifically because someone who's born in China and is an immigrant into Canada, the US or Europe is a very different experience than being Chinese, being Canadian born Chinese. So there's the culture of our roots and our heritage. There's the culture of our ancestors, so how how our past impacts us. There is the culture of the society, the social, eco-political landscapes that we live in, because if you're growing up in a time of war or a time of poverty, the culture of your certain circumstances are going to change. And then there's culture about intersectionality. So then there is what happens when two cultures meet. Obviously, there's that being like Canadian born Chinese. There's an intersectionality with my Canadianness and my Chinese heritage. Recently, I was actually talking on my podcast about Lunar New Year and even realizing there was a deeper intersectionality within being Chinese, because I'm actually Cantonese Shanghainese. And so one of the things we talk, when we delve into culture is the depth of the culture. So there's culture and then there's depth of culture. you can't just, if you were writing a fantasy story and you just had like the blanket Asian, right? And we see this a lot, right? When we watch fiction, is like the blanket Asian, and they are usually coded towards whatever culture that the writer probably fetishizes, which is like a whole different thing. And I don't know if we'll dive that deep into the whole concept of fetishization of Asian culture, which happens a lot in fiction, and how it can lead to a lot of inaccuracies, but depth matters. So China's a large country. You can't just say Chinese and the end of it. China has over 100 different dialects, multiple different provinces. So even just from a broad-scape perspective, I'm Cantonese, Shanghainese, and those comes with two different types of cuisine. And I actually didn't know that growing up because I just ate whatever my grandmother fed to me. And only now as an adult, as I start exploring and trying to kind of communicate this to an audience, that I realize that I grew up in a melting pot myself. So you're talking about depth of culture, talking about intersectionality, there's innovation, culture changes. So what happens when you have when you have French chefs who are studying Japanese techniques, which is actually a really big thing right now? What happens when you have the children of mixed race parents? Or what happens when you have someone who is Mexican but studying French techniques? So I would think culture is the giant web of everything that encapsulates food and drink, and how it informs our broader stories and identities overall.
And
something that I don't even know if that answered the question or just
no, that did. I mean, the question was like, what does food culture encapsulate? And I remember, oh yeah, I just want to shout out Essie Zachs. I won't say her full name, but is a chef, a trained chef who I know does not just Filipino food, but a bunch of other cuisines whose food I've eaten, and is fantastically talented. And just very excited to have you here.
Where are you based, Essie, so I can come eat your food?
I believe earlier mentioned Vancouver. Yeah, so fusion of Filipino and Middle Eastern food. Actually, Essie prepared basically the hot wings challenge for me once when I was, or not for me actually, I was just there. It was for somebody else, but I got to benefit from it as a side. And like 10 different hot sauced wings, and then also did, what was the other dish that you did that day? Anyway, phenomenal stuff.
If you are a restaurant, if you work at a restaurant, dear chat, if any of you work in a restaurant and you shout out your space in chat, I guarantee if I'm ever in your city, I will come and eat at your place. That is like my favorite form of tourism. Just saying.
Yeah.
Chinatown's a big place. I don't know if I can find you specifically in Chinatown. You'll have to give me something more specific. Hey, okay. Anyways,
yeah,
so that's amazing.
Yeah, and something that I was really interested in, I was thinking about like, what does food culture mean? And I had the chance to listen to your episode of Tasting Together where you interviewed Chef Shane. And for those who are coming in late, Chef Shane Chartrand, originally our guest today, was suddenly ill and had to cancel like literally just a couple of hours before we went live. Miroki has come in instead to talk to us with her huge library of experience about food and drink as a writer and a podcaster and traveler. We're getting a chance to plumb her expertise now. But you had this phenomenal interview with Chef Shane on your podcast, Tasting Together. And he talks a little bit about also some of the differences in like sharing food, like what it means to sit down and have a meal together with someone within one culture or another. Cultures that like eat with their hands versus cultures that use utensils, and how even the customs around like how food is consumed can be really different culture to culture. I know that you're very widely traveled. You've eaten in a lot of different places. You're especially familiar with different food culture aspects in North America and in China and other parts of Asia. I've heard you talk about different food cultures. I was wondering if you've noticed sort of differences between food cultures and what you've picked up on in that sense.
Oh, I mean, always, and I think I would respond with, where would you want me to begin, or if there's anything you would be very curious about, because I can ramble, which can go very far. But if there's anything that chat's really interested in, or you're specifically interested in, I can delve into those with more precision, I guess.
I think the thing that I'm most interested in, or the thing that I really got to thinking about after listening to your podcast, was about, okay, I guess two things. How meals are shared. So like, what does it mean to share the space and the time of a meal? Like, how do you gather and how do you eat? And is it like talkative? Is it formal? Is it familiar? And then
Halifax Wi-Fi?
Oh no.
Oh no. Am I back?
We're back. We're back.
Okay. It did just start snowing heavily here. I hope we're not in for something.
How does snow change the food experience? It means you have a guaranteed refrigerator for a few months outside your home.
I also hate that snow with the disrupting with the internet disrupting I don't know.
As a weird tangent, I'm always reminded of that Pokemon episode where you actually, if you want to talk a little bit about food and snow, there's that episode in Pokemon where it's snowing heavily. I think it was like a special. And everyone's talking about how cold they are and how miserable they are. And then Jessie from Team Rocket is like dancing and singing. She's like, snow, snow, I love it so. And she's the only one. And everyone's like, why are you so happy? Like, why do you love snow so much? Everyone's freezing to death. And the whole thing is like, she gets this flashback about how it's like her favorite time of year because during that time, her like mother would make her all these dishes out of snow because she was extremely poor growing up. So when it was snowing time, her mother, who basically never could feed her, would use snow to make all these different things and say, happy Snowgasboard. And it would all be just snow. And it was just her imagination. But this like moment defined so much about her character and backstory that you're like, holy shit, this is Pokemon.
It's like the horrifying version of like the imaginary food from like Hook that the Lost Boys eat. But except like instead of like actually getting food that you imagine, you just have snow.
So anyways, you were talking about gatherings is what you said.
So the culture around how food is consumed and shared is really interesting to me. And then yesterday, actually during our pre-interview call with Chef Shane, and he talked about what does it mean to feed someone as well. To like give someone nourishment, to prepare a dish that says something about your culture or your heritage. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you've experienced that in your travels, and I guess where you've seen maybe differences between. I know specifically you've talked before about thinking about how like Chinese food and food culture is experienced in North America. So I guess the differences between North American and Chinese food culture in that regard, I'd also be really interested to hear about.
I think one of the things that maybe is even worth mentioning is that I think there's becoming a slow death of the gathering as we, at least in North America, I would say, as we become more busy, more autonomous, you don't see people sitting down to have a family meal much anymore. Even if you live in a household of several of a family, they even show this in television shows. You get like the like teenager who comes and takes his dinner and he takes it up to his room, or people are eating at different times because someone's coming home late or someone has an activity over here. No one's really spending time to gather. And I think historically there was it was a moment that everyone came together. It was meant to be a moment of stillness, of peace, and of appreciation. That, you sit there and you really enjoy your food. And I think a lot of us are beginning to lose that element of our lives. So food as a gathering place, I think the cultures that still hold on to them tend to be cultures that also carry a lot of family values. So I think that, sometimes it does happen a little bit more frequently in Asia, or especially more like remote areas of Asia. Or if you go to Europe, there's still a lot of like the element of the family, right? Like in Italy, the concept of the familia is a really big thing. And everyone will gather together at the same time and sit down. And when you speak of the gathering and you speak of stillness, it's also an appreciation of food. And maybe it's a respect to food too. If you're just shoveling the food inside of your mouth, are you actually tasting the food, or is the food just feeding you? There's a concept in food that we talk about, like whether you're a utilitarian eater or like an eater for the experience. And I will fully admit that especially for a large period of my life, because I have a lot of digestive issues, I'm a utilitarian eater a lot of the times, which means that the food is meant to keep me alive. It doesn't need to necessarily taste the best, but it's designed to keep me alive. And then there's people, then there's food for flavor but I think regardless of whether you're eating for health or whether you're eating for pleasure, you need to sit down and appreciate, because the gathering space, I think we forget that it's actually a contribution to our health as well. When you eat in a rush, your body physically can't digest food. So the idea of us coming together is meant to nourish you. So whether or not you're actually eating for like health reasons or pleasure, it still has to nourish you, and the stillness helps nourish you. Now, with regards to, so that's just like me on a kind of pedestal with the philosophy and ideology about gathering space these days in modern culture and society. When it comes to differences in culture, I think this is one thing that is, I can state immediately was uniquely for my experience growing up. Growing up Chinese, a lot of the food is like shared, right? You reach for the food. So you put out all the dishes and you reach for the food and you lean over and you serve, right? And that's why a lot of, you can see sometimes a lot of Asian homes, you'll see the big lazy Susan, right? The big spinning table. I remember going to my white friend's house for the first time. I think the first time I was really like allowed to have dinner at a friend's house, I was 7. My parents were very protective, and people like passed dishes around. And I was very confused. Like, I didn't understand what I was supposed to do. And I remember sitting there at the table thinking to myself, if I want seconds, then what do I do? Do we pass it around like all over again? Like, I remember not knowing this and not having a handbook. And I think maybe something we should always think about when we're writing these things is that things we take for granted, other people might not take for granted. And curiosity is always something I like seeing in creative work, because we need to remember that we always have, I think the thing we have to do as writers is to regularly check our assumptions, especially if we're choosing to write for a diverse audience or bringing diversity in. Whether or not your writing tends to be coded within a certain society, like a more Western-based society or a more Eastern-based society or Middle Eastern, you're going to still have a lot of things that other people do not understand. Now, I think a lot of people who are usually born of a different culture outside of the kind of typical Eurocentric culture, especially when it comes to food and drink, we've already felt the need to explain ourselves a lot because generally our food has been othered for most of our lives. But I would say that I would challenge people who write primarily in the North American culture to recognize that sometimes the things that they do that are standardized aren't standard for other people. So I would say that that's one thing for me. I'm trying to think about how else to approach this. Am I answering the question at all? Or is there any like funnel you want me to dive deeper down under? So that's some sort of difference between Western and Eastern culture. I know, and like, I know in the other thing is like in Chinese cultures, one thing we like doing is feeding, is like when we serve ourselves, we serve other people. So there's hierarchies, like there's a respect for the hierarchy of the table. We tend to want to serve like our siblings. We always like pour tea for the parents first. So there's like a moment of a lot of unspoken communication that happens in the gathering space as well. That is very like standardized in a lot of Asian cultures. I think is not quite as existent in the North American culture. I remember actually going for a dinner when Eric and I just started dating. It was like one of the days before Passover, and his family all ordered takeout. And it was just like a fight to the finish. It was just like the food arrived and it just like people just all dove in. And I remember feeling like mortally offended because I remember thinking to myself, a lot of Asian cultures are based on humbleness and based on serving and based on being of consideration to other people. And there's a lot of talks when it comes to anthropological studies or social studies or psychology that Asian cultures tend to defer to other people first. Whereas a lot of North American cultures tend to center themselves first. We're taught to be autonomous and be very independent. And when those two cultures come together, it often ends up at an impasse somewhere. Unfortunately, often at the detriment to a culture that tends to be more kind of service right? Because it means that the ones of service is often going to lose out on those things. And, this is this is where I'm getting a little bit political here, but obviously I'm talking about how it permeates food culture, but think about how it permeates everyday life as well. And like, sometimes you can see it, like food culture informs a lot of who we are as human beings, right? If you're serving someone else first, that respect you show someone else. If you clean your plate, right? If you eat everything on your plate, what does that mean? What symbols does it mean? If you have like a messy food, like if your food area is messy as opposed to being clean, do you stack your dishes and bring them to the sink when you're done eating? Or do you just leave it there? Like, I think all that informs a lot about how a person is. Think about if you are writing a story and if you write about like the guy who just like, you know, sloppily, like, you know, spilling his stuff everywhere and finishes eating and just like gets up and leaves, right? It says a lot about that particular character.
So now from that, we're gonna jump to a little bit about food production. So you've like done a lot of work in wine. You visited a lot of wineries. I've been lucky enough to visit a lot of them with you as kind of a bystander to the whole process. But so you've been to go to the places that food and drink are produced. So like vineyards for grapes and cider. Do you have any tips for how world builders can connect the environment of their world to the ingredients that are grown or harvested for food, and how that kind of becomes a meal or a drink on a table eventually?
Travel, like spend some time experiencing it yourself too. And I mean, you know, you can travel in your own backyard. Like I recognize that not everyone can go off gallivanting on adventures. And like, to be fair, I've done a lot of my travel, especially back in the day, was like as a backpacker. I was extremely broke, and I would be the kind of person that literally would spend like $1 eating food all day. I remember when I backpacked to Iceland, I kid you not, guys, like I literally had a jar of coconut oil that I ate for like breakfast and lunch some days. One, because there was no food available out there during low season, but two, because it was a calorie dense food, and I would save it just so I could eat one really interesting meal every day. And that was just something I was very passionate about. And I think, you know, when you go to a restaurant, maybe spend some time like just observing your surroundings. Like, how are the tables set? Are they using mismatched chairs? Do they, you know, are all the like when they serve the mains, are they all served at the same time? Do the plates have chips on it? Like, that speaks a lot to how like a business is managing and how they treat their food and how they care about their food. Does the menu just say cheese, or are they giving you like Conte versus Gouda? Is the cheese smoked, and are they telling you where it's from? And that's a chance for you to learn a lot about the ingredients that exist and where they all come from. If you go to a space that says, if you go to a place that's like a wine bar, ask them. Here's the other thing: like, ask questions. Like, don't be afraid to ask questions about the ingredients or about what's going on your plate. Maybe if you find a restaurant that talks about being farm to table, like maybe take a moment to examine what that means. Look at the ingredients. Most farm to table restaurants will happily and proudly share with you, you know, where all their ingredients are sourced. And it gives you a chance to like think and learn. Like, I know when I was out in Halifax, actually, this time, one of the previous times to work with Peter, we went out for dinner and they were talking about like the PEI steak, the PEI cattle. And I did not know that Atlantic red meat was a thing. Like that it's actually very prized, that, you know, that red meat from Prince Edward Island or from New Brunswick is actually like a really prestigious cut of meat. And that's something I learned just from reading the menu alone. If you enjoy partaking in a beverage, like you don't have to go to a winery, like take a moment to read the back of the label. So, okay. Off screen, I said to Peter and Eric before this live stream, I'm like, do I need to have like food and beverages in front of me in case like I want to share? And he's like, I don't know, do you? So I'm gonna grab this one here. So this is a bourbon. So most of us know what bourbon is. You know, and if you don't, then it's basically a spirit that is made, in order for it to be called bourbon, I believe it has to be from Kentucky specifically, or unless they've changed the rules.
I think that changed.
They changed it. Okay, so historically, yes, because this is made in California and they're calling it bourbon. So historically, in order to be called bourbon, it had to be made in Kentucky specifically, and clearly they've widened that to allow different regions. That's another random food thing, but I won't go too deep into that. But this one of, you know, you spend a little bit of time reading the label. And if you read the label, you know, it talks about the ingredients, like bottled in bond bourbon whiskey from the Savage Cook Distillery in California, selected for the Howling Mob heirloom corn. So you realize in this moment that this bourbon is not just randomly made from like, you know, that corn this or that barley this. This is made from Howling Mob heirloom corn. So that's telling you in an instant something that's really special and unique about this bottle. And people use that to describe in their books all the time, right? They'll be like, that the elf made wine from this, or like this, we brought oysters from the seas of like Acacia or something, right? It's like, that's how we use that to qualify the quality of our about the, or enrich the stories that we tell. Now, don't just make it up. I would say the kind of depth of work that you do for your characters, if you want to world build, you probably want to spend that same love for your food. If you're visiting wineries and distilleries, take time to ask questions. Take time to taste, like really taste, and maybe taste several different things. You would be so like, one thing I love to do with people when I'm showing wine to people, and for anyone who's really interested, I'll tell you, you can do this at home, and you can always DM me my 9 ounces, please, for any thoughts on this. But I challenge you, and you can, this is going to cost like maybe like 20-ish bucks a bottle. Get a Californian Chardonnay, get an Oregon Chardonnay if you can, or get a Californian Chardonnay, get a Chablis or Petit Chablis, get a Chardonnay from like South Africa. Taste the 3. They will taste distinctly different. And this is the reason why. This is actually really a pretty good example. It's all Chardonnay, just so you know. Californian Chardonnay historically makes a really buttery, heavy Chardonnay. So, I'm sure a lot of you guys have ever tasted, when a lot of people think about Chardonnay, forget it being from California. A lot of us associate Chardonnay with being like a big buttery bomb popcorn. And that's because most of consumers have been dictated by Californian wine over the years. Just because they blew up on the market. They basically dominate like over 90% of the American market, if not the Canadian market as well. And we all think Chardonnay tastes like buttered popcorn. It does not. That's just how California makes it. So let me challenge you guys that for a sec. If you go pick up a Petit Chablis from France, that's also Chardonnay. It's called Petit Chablis because it's from the Chablis region of France. They rarely oak their wines, and they're known for their Chablis is known for being a region that sits on top of a bed of like 4 million year old seashell soil. And it's all fossilized shells. And basically you get that like salty minerality transferring over to the grapes. So in direct contrast to butter popcorn, you're getting a steely, acid-driven mineral Chardonnay. They're both Chardonnay, but different regions do completely different things.
Interesting.
Does that help even a little bit?
I think so.
Yeah, that very much answers the question. Yeah.
Go
ahead. So I guess we're gonna now kind of combine. We're gonna shift gears a little bit. We talked about the real world. Now we're gonna like start veering off from the stories that we have about food in the present day and that we get to experience versus the ones we're gonna just make up entirely. So if you were asked to consult on a fantasy or a sci-fi movie that wanted to create a fictional culture inspired by elements from the Chinese food culture you were talking about earlier, what are some of the things that you would want to see in kind of a fantasy or sci-fi version of Chinese food?
I think, as you're thinking, I'm going to throw one more question to the chat here. Something that I'm curious about. What is your favorite food or food culture from fiction? So if there's like a particular dish, or even just like a meal that appears in fiction that you love, or a food culture, I'd love to hear about that in the chat.
So the question is specifically Chinese. We're not doing blanket Asian.
Yeah, and if you want to be specific within Chinese,
I think here's the thing, right? Like the thing I'm always finding fascinating about fantasy cultures that embrace cultural elements is how do we do it in a way that it's interesting, because I think we're like very used to creating fantasy worlds that are Eurocentric. And it's still a little bit newer that we're creating fantasy worlds that are embracing of other people's cultures and being able to do it in a reasonably respectful way, as opposed to just pulling out the things that make sense to us. So we can code it, I guess, Chinese in this case. And I guess what I would probably try to do is I think I would be very curious to know about the period. I would also be kind of curious to know about, here's something actually worth mentioning to people too, right? Because sometimes I think we can dive down world building rabbit holes until the point where we don't know when to stop and when to just write the damn story. And sometimes the truth is maybe the food doesn't matter. And I actually think about this when I remember there was a period of time when I did my literature course in science fiction. And I think it was The Neuromancer that we read. And we read The Neuromancer, and there was a good portion of the class that were extremely hot and bothered about how the tech in Neuromancer was not accurate. They were like, oh, computers don't work this way, and this is how computers should work. And I was like, guys, this is a book written in the 80s. Like, they didn't know how computers were working like back then. Like, and also that's not the point of the story, right? The idea was like about how technology was changing humanity and changing people, but it wasn't a story. The story wasn't about like how to program this computer, right? The computer was a foil. So maybe if the food culture, if people are just traveling and they're just having dinner and they're having a feast and they're just like, oh, let's have a feast. We will have the best rice wine and all the, like, a suckling pig. Maybe that's all you need to give like a taste of something. But if you have a fiction that is grounded in, and you're wanting to use food to define the experience of the characters, whether it's because that, you know, they're having a feast and food has like poison maybe is in one of the plates, and you have to kind of decide how is that poison like successful in being masked, or like how they were able to smell it in the food. You know, if you have things like that, they may matter. Or again, if you're using it to define social class. So if it's like someone who's traveling and they arrived and they're sitting and they're very intimidated by the food that's being served in front of them, and they don't know the first thing about like etiquette per se. They didn't, you know, they don't realize that this is a hand washing bowl, or they don't realize that they're supposed to eat from they don't realize that if you put your chopsticks a certain way on your plate, it's actually considered offensive, right? Like if you stick your chopsticks in your rice vertically like this, it's basically a sign for worshiping the dead. So you probably don't want to do that. So like, you know, there's those things then matter greatly, right? Like it was actually in, I think the anime Shaman King, they actually did that on purpose, because he's like a guy who he's a shaman, he commutes with the dead. So he's being served a meal and he's eating a meal. Then he gets a second bowl and sticks like a pair of chopsticks into it because he's serving his ghost friend. And then his other friend who doesn't see ghosts was like, this is so morbid, man. Like, why would you do that? Because in Japanese culture, it's actually like really offensive to do this. But this character did it very purposefully because he has a ghost friend and he wants the ghost friend to partake in rice with him. So then suddenly all these little elements matter. So I think like realize when it matters for you in your writing, and realize when it's okay to not need to dive deep into it. Look, I always invite people to deep dive into it because frankly, the more you know, you would be surprised by how much it can enrich your storytelling without you even knowing about it. I think what it really sometimes comes down to is, as writers, as creators, and maybe this is going to sound really, I hope I don't come off preachy saying this, but I think if we want to be creators and writers and we want to share things with the world, I think we have a duty to also enrich ourselves with the experience of the world. Because how narcissistic would we be if we were like, what I experience in my own four walls is enough? Like that I sit here in my four corners without ever experiencing anything else in my life other than, I don't know, Mickey D's every day. And somehow I'm going to go and tell it, like write a story and tell everyone that, you know, about this, like about the like Asian flavor, or the like they ate a sushi, right? And like I'm not even articulating it very well because I don't even know how to articulate a lack of understanding of cuisine. But I've definitely seen situations like this, and I can tell you that like it comes off leaps and bounds when someone does pick up on it, and you do not want to be that person. But I think it's like I think what I'm just trying to say is like we need to kind of always be curious and need to check our arrogance at the door when it comes to if we want to be asking people to read our work, then I think it's our duty to constantly be expanding our spheres of knowledge.
Yeah, and I will say that like that is the reason why for Deck of Worlds more than any other deck, but also for Lore Masters deck, we brought in writers from a bunch of different backgrounds and cultures because we knew that trying to represent the breadth of the human experience through one white suburban Canadian boy's ideas for writing prompts for world building would be like a horrible idea that would be so restrictive in its scope and would miss out on so many opportunities for looking at other elements of world building or other connections to world building and culture. It's also the reason why for the Culture Keyholes deck, which we may have a chance to use today when we transition to the prompts portion of our live stream, for Culture Keyholes, we did, there's two things in the instruction book which say like question the prompt. Like actually ask what the question is assuming and be willing to ask questions of that. And I think the example we used is, but there's a question in there that says like, at what age do they move away from home or do they leave the home? That question assumes that they leave the home, that you don't have multi-generational families living in the same space. So part of the goal there was again to like be willing to check assumptions at the door and encourage people to check assumptions that are baked into the questions and to question maybe their first impulses for which answers they're reaching for. So yeah, I think that is super well said. And I think that we'll maybe take a moment to ask a couple of the questions that came in from the chat over our discussion, and then we'll actually switch to prompts. And for this round, what we're going to be doing is Miroki is our kind of consultant designer for the food culture for, and I think we're going to do it as though it's like a movie that we're making. We're making a movie. There's going to be a fictional culture. We know that food is going to be important, and we'll draw prompts from Deck of Worlds, maybe some from Lore Masters deck as well, to world build this culture and really look at the connections between the prompts and food. Miroki will be leading those decisions. We'll throw some questions to the chat to vote. And I think the goal is to end up with an idea for a scene in this movie in which food or food culture is going to be really important to the story and the world. But here's that really wonderful question that we had earlier. I was really excited about this one.
Yeah, would it make sense to look at what kinds of foods are pre-packaged in the world and can we pull anything from that? I mean, absolutely. I brought up the whole concept of like if you were living in a world during poverty or during wartime or during an apocalypse, I think seeing what is prepackaged would would show a lot in that world about what's fresh, what's accessible, or maybe show like what are the conditions that the world is living in, that indicates like what they have and what they don't have. I think the other thing we can also look at is wealth, or society. Like if you have a person, maybe even not even just the world, like a character. If you visit, this is a great one. So if anyone watches Queer Eye, the moment when they like go through like the person's kitchen and look at their food and like, 'cause they always have like the food guy and they're always like looking. If you go and visit a person and you open their fridge and their fridge is empty and all you see is a fridge full of beer, then you open their pantry and all you see is instant noodles. What does that say about that character, right? So I think you can definitely pull something about when you have something like prepackaged food. What does that define about a character? What does it define about a society? And yeah.
And there's even just like the technological component. It's like if you're in a sci-fi setting, it's like how you preserve food is like what technology, like freezing is like kind of like one of the marvels of the modern world that we kind of take for granted because you couldn't really do that, a few hundred years ago.
Yeah, and you also can even look at it from the lens of export, because not everyone can, like if you think about it, if you think about the supply chain of prepackaged foods, like how does food, like think about this for a moment, folks, right? How does food get prepackaged? Where does it come from, right? You're not pulling a corn from a field. Like farm to table, and sometimes it's easy in a respect. A farmer grows the corn. I mean, there's different ways that farmers can grow corn, but in the end, the corn is grown, and you either buy it from them they either sell it to a supermarket and it's sold to you, but it's perishable. At some point, the life of the corn ends. Prepackaged food doesn't do that. But how do they get there, right? Like you're not getting a single person making little like zippies of instant noodles. These are going through machines. They're going through factories. Like it requires a large amount of overhead to pre-package food. Who's doing that? And how does that reach a market? How does that reach markets around the world? So we recently Eric and I came back from Cuba, and in Cuba they have a massive, they have the embargo with America, and I can tell you that there's not that much prepackaged food over there because they literally can't get it. Cuba is quite an impoverished country, and they do not have the means to prepackage food on their own. Whatever they're getting from abroad, usually from Canada, maybe a little bit from Europe, but it comes at a massive premium. So sometimes we think of prepackaged food as low grade or like cheap food. And I think that's because in a first world country, it can be seen as cheap food because it's preserved and it can last a long time. But in other countries, it's not the same. It's completely flipped. So I think that's something that's worth thinking about.
Yeah, and I would say the other thing you can think about from a perspective of like, if you're going for a fantasy world or a world in which there isn't a ton of technology for food preparation, like lembas, elvish waybread from Lord of the Rings, is an example of. I mean, it's packaged in the leaves, in how it's done in the films. I can't remember if they specify that they're wrapped in leaves or not in the novels, but this is an example of a portable food that is prepared and meant to last a long time, which is basically like a granola bar without a wrapper around it. So like pemmican in real life, food that's specifically designed around its portability and its preservation and its use in that circumstance.
Is it worth mentioning though, then prepackaged is not the same as preservation?
Oh yeah, that's true
too. Prepackaged food is a form of preservation because a lot of prepackaged food does tend to last for a long period of time. But you can preserve food without ever prepackaging it for mass consumption.
Yeah, that's true. And I think what's interesting about the question is the combination of so how food units are separated and stored and the technology involved in that. But I think also the idea of food that is ready to eat that you don't have to prepare is part of like that doesn't have to be made fresh in the moment and you don't have to prepare. So I think part of what is interesting about like how do cultures have those, because I think most do in some form or another. I think it's one of the aspects of that that's sort of interesting to look at. But speaking of like level of technology, so if we were going to jump into doing some prompts, Miroki, do you want to do world building in like a science fiction level technology for a world? Do we want to do something that's more fantasy based? Where would you like to take this if we were going to? You're going to be our consultant here.
Oh. See, like it's interesting as fantasy, you are always allowed more liberties in some ways. Science fiction, because science fiction inherently is still grounded usually in the world that we occupy, just typically more futuristic or more technologically driven. You're basically using the same foods to define it. What does chat want? I'm okay with deferring to what chat wants to do.
Okay. So why don't you do you want to conduct the vote in the chat? You can count us in.
Oh, we're doing a count to 3. I was waiting for the big debate to start. And
I think we've conditioned them at this point that votes happen on the count of 3.
Yeah.
Well, I was waiting for like everyone to pitch their reasoning for why they would want me to discuss things a certain way, but I'm happy to defer to the 3, 2, 1, go.
For fantasy or sci-fi.
Yeah. And I did it very much the Guy Fieri way, where it just was like 3, 2, 1, go.
That's not the Guy Fieri way. The Guy Fieri way is like there's going to be 3. there's 3 people on this live stream, but when we started, there were only 2.
I think I'm still actually thinking about this preservation question, this prepackaged question, because I very much interpret the question of prepackaging as the idea that it is a kind of food that is replicated over and over and over again. So it's like a bag of chips, right? Which for me is not the same as calling like food that is preserved for future consumption or for can last a long period of time, or food that is prepared in advance, ready to eat food, right? Which is like, I prepared the food and it might have some reasonably finite life, but like it's like a sandwich, right? But you can like take it away and have it at a later time of day. Like, they all have very different meanings for me, and for me they all carry very different impacts on the narrative based on that per se.
Yeah, no, I agree. There's definitely a difference there. I think I'm looking at, if you're looking at a world where they don't have mass production, how do you bring some of those themes about food that's not just prepared, but is prepared in a way that is like shelf stable, that is prepared in a way where like you can take it on the 8-month sea voyage, and that hardtack is going to be about as bad on day 150 as it is on day 1. So I think that's what I'm thinking about. If we were going to export some of the themes of what it means to have prepackaged food into a fantasy context where we're not going to have the technology, the mass production, what are some ways we could represent that idea?
Or then what does it mean for like a fantasy world to have mass production? Because the idea, like the fact that I don't know, maybe there is one and I'm just not recalling it. But I'm surprised there isn't a fantasy world yet where someone's like, there's like I guess it's kind of like Santa's workshop. We're like, why do we not see like a bunch of wizards against their will who are like mass producing this or that? It's like wizard sweatshop.
It's like
I have an example.
Okay.
It's the children's book Strega Nona about a witch with a magical pot that keeps making pasta and won't stop making pasta.
I forgot about that book.
But a mass-produced, I'm using magic to mass-produce an instant food, and it actually literally floods the market. I think literally the marketplace of the town becomes flooded with noodles.
I mean, I guess one of the reasons possibly why too is like one thing I remember seeing in a lot of fantasy is like the idea that most people can't make food from nothing. Like even alchemists can't really make food from rocks and stuff like that. So it doesn't matter if you're starving or if you're thirsty, and maybe it all alludes back to like the Bible, because Jesus was able to magically make bread and wine, and people are like, it's too godlike to have the capability to make food from nothing. So perhaps like
it is kind of interesting where it's like how many different magic rule sets kind of have that as a rule, and it's like the unstated part they never really tell you is that if you can make food, from scratch, magically make food from rocks, you basically solved humanity. It's like
you solved a really core
there's
problem.
Officially like so many problems just go away if you can do that. And like the question is, well, if you can do that, why aren't you just solving these problems? It's like, why don't you just use your $1 billion to solve world hunger? And it's like an even more extreme version of that.
Yeah, well, I guess fantasy prepackaging might not involve creating food from scratch. It might be like, I don't know, like I could see, this could be an interesting one. Like I could see a like agriculture, like a bunch of wizards or magic folk who find this rich land and they plant these seeds and they rapidly accelerate the growth of this plant so that they could harvest it to make, I don't know, popcorn. Like let's say it's corn. They magically force grow this plant to make into popcorn, and then they strip it and they keep like forcing like this to happen at speed. It's like monoculture farming basically, but you're sapping the land dry and the land's like dying all around, and then maybe the popcorn is getting mutated because they're like ripping the kernels down. You're just like, it's basically like inbreeding like the same stock of corn over and over again, and it's like becoming this massive conglomerate. But like at somewhere around the world, people are starting to die or get ill from eating this popcorn, and no one knows why. And there's this huge conspiracy that follows you back to this like giant exploitative monoculture corn farm.
Magical.
And you know what? That would be a really good that would be a really good fantasy political statement about monoculture farming, which is something that we actually do need to address in the supply chain.
Magical Monsanto. I'm here for it.
Yes.
Well, I think I think fantasy got the vote, so I think we have an opportunity here to tell exactly the type of story that you want.
I did want to shout out because this is actually a pretty fun, different take on why nobody does magic food that I do enjoy. So thank you for sharing that, Wyvern.
You could create food magically, but it tastes terrible. That's a fun little limitation. And if you want to, specifically for the question about how magic fits into the systems of power of your world and how it replaces labor and how to think through some interesting questions around that, we have a blog that I can't remember if it was the guest blog that we did for C.R. Rowanson or that C.R. Rowanson did for us. But if you search C.R. Rowanson, magic, how does magic affect power in your world? If you Google those words, you'll find it. And there's some really interesting questions about that. But I think let us bring out the heart of the cards. And let's do a little bit of world building. So we don't necessarily have to use the fantasy expansion because the main deck of worlds codes towards fantasy. But if you do want to use cards from the fantasy expansion, we can as well. And why don't we start with some region cards? And Miroki, you can guide us through what you're thinking for what kind of region would be interesting to think about from a storytelling and food perspective.
Okay, give me the regions. Lay them down for me.
We have a marsh, an island, and woods.
Marsh, island, or woods. So just, I think for interest, and I think I am going to invite chat to vote at some point, but I'm going to pick islands to start because islands are isolated, or might not be. Maybe there's maybe it's very close to the mainland, or maybe they are, there's like a series of islands next to each other. But I'm going to start with islands because I feel like that could lead to some interesting challenges with regards to like food supply or people's relationships with cultures or even isolation from cultures.
I think it's a really interesting choice. I'm super into that. Cool. Okay. Well, then let's get some landmarks going. And I think let's draw 2 landmark cards so there's some additional choices so that we can really think through how we want this to connect to the food culture.
All right. So landmarks. I'm going to draw 2 cards. I'm going to draw more cards.
Why did you reject them?
They were on last week's live stream. So we have a village, a gorge, a dump, or a thicket.
A village.
The dump might have been on last week's stream too, but it's funny. So
a village, a dump, a gorge, and a thicket.
Yeah. And a little, oh, sorry, no, go ahead, share your thoughts.
Oh, I was going to let chat vote for this one.
Okay. Then let's go ahead and have chat vote. I think, why don't you pick one and chat picks one? So think about what you want to choose while chat votes. And chat, I prepared a few like discussion questions around like with each card type, what you might think through if you're specifically thinking about world building through a food culture perspective. So for the landmark card, you'll notice landmark cards usually have a location that is like person-made or human-made, anthropologically centered. So like a dump, for example, is something you can't have in a world with no people. Dumping is what happens when you get a lot of people. Likewise, the village is a thing you can only have in a world with people, whereas a thicket or a gorge is natural. So for the natural landmarks, thinking through what kind of food is gathered here, is it hunted, is it cultivated, what can be grown. That doesn't just include plants, but like fungus, fish, wildlife, bugs. Like these are all things that can be food sources. So what kind of food can be gathered there? Also for the more anthropocentric locations, how can they be used to gather for food, for feasting, for preparing food, for storing food? So these are all questions that can be interesting to ask yourself as you are about to vote for a location. And sorry, I'll pass over to you guys for conducting the vote.
Well, we'll say a quick 3, 2, 1, go. Get this show on the road.
Also, if chat's saying anything to me, and I'm not responding directly, I'm going to apologize. My contacts are a little bit off today. I'm not actually reading the screen very well. So unless it gets put up on the main screen, I can't really read the tiny text off to the side. So I'm going to rely on Eric and Peter that if anyone's asking really specific questions to me to put it up or at least relay it to me so I can answer it properly. But if people have...
There's some good ones.
Yeah.
People have been talking about heirloom at rats a lot. It's been things in the chat.
Yeah.
And then a pun for you because you love them so much. Gorge. What else with food?
Oh my god.
Oh yeah, you missed some good puns. There's some wine puns.
Okay, earlier. Maybe I'm glad I'm not speaking puns.
You intentionally sabotaged your eyeballs to protect yourself.
But more just if people have questions about places like around the world, and if I have traveled to them, like I would more than happily answer. And actually one of the things I might do before we end the podcast, since I already did pull out this like small plethora of food items, I think sometimes, in my opinion, I think we all get really interested in talking about the culture of food, but I'd be curious to know how often people truly do integrate food in depth in their storytelling, and whether it is, just easy or hard or just not worth it in people's minds. I think like as chefs and as food, like people who are chefs and people who are foodies and people who are enthusiasts, like we want to tell these stories. Like we just obsess about telling these stories all the time. We want people to know where all the things are coming from. But I think sometimes as writers, it's not the most dominant thing in our mind. So sometimes it ends up being deprioritized in favor of like character development or driving the plot. So I would always be interested in knowing, seeing how like useful it is. But the reason why I mentioned all the food here is at the end, I almost want to like very quickly show each of these items where they're from, and hopefully in like almost show and telling, just showing all these things, it helps you get inspiration for how to incorporate things in your like storytelling in your small way and why it matters. Like there's a part of me that's like, hey, maybe if I shared the story of each of these things, you would be more interested in too, in showing why it matters in your stories as well. Yeah, anyways, what was the vote?
Right now we have 2 for thicket, and we stalled out there.
What? So we didn't hit 3?
We haven't hit 3 yet.
What?
Wait, so we've actually introduced, just in case there's anyone's first live stream with us, we can talk about how we normally do voting. So voting, we'll walk through all the different cues that are available, we'll list them out, and then we'll say 3, 2, 1, go. And then once we've said go, you can hit enter. You can preload your word into the chat, but you can't hit enter until we say go. And that's just because sometimes we have longer queues, so people have to type in more, and we want to keep that fair and even. And often there's a bit of a rush, so we do the first thing to get 3 votes, because so every now and then the chat is just too unwieldy, there's too much coming in too quickly. So we go by first to 3 instead of by majority. I think Thicket ended up taking it. Yes, beautiful. And again, chat, we'd love to hear about how food shows up in your storytelling or your world building. That was Miroki's question to you. So let's go ahead with a namesake card.
So we have of clocks, songless, where flowers grow, and of gems.
If you haven't seen a namesake card before, actually, sorry, we did that thing of not doing the introduction broadly for how our whole thing works. By the way, we are the 3 people who run the Story Engine. Our website is storyenginedeck.com. The Story Engine is a deck of cards for coming up with instant ideas for stories or elements of story that you can use in your Dungeons & Dragons campaigns or for writing your novel. It's a really multifaceted tool. Today, we are using the Deck of Worlds. Deck of Worlds specifically is our deck for world building prompts. You draw 1 card type at a time, and you combine them in order to create an interesting world with a unique past, present, and future. We've drawn the region card, which is our island, which is our main terrain type that we're working with. We've drawn a landmark card to give it a point of interest. That's the thicket. And now we are drawing the namesake card, which gives you a little fragment of a nickname you can combine with either the islands or the thicket to give it an in-world lore-based nickname that starts your brain thinking about, why is it called that? What does that mean about the world? And we're looking for opportunities to connect these little nickname fragments to food culture. So we could have the songless islands, we could have the thicket where flowers grow, we could have the island of gems, we could have the thicket of clocks. We could combine any of these fragments. So Miroki, what's speaking to you here?
If we're focusing on food culture, I would call attention to the flowers, because maybe the flowers could serve as a edible food item at some point, or it's a medicine, or it's a poison. So, and I don't know yet, but we know that flowers are very versatile for many things. It could also just mean, and you know what? Maybe as we further go along, maybe the flowers mean nothing. Maybe it's just very pretty.
Yeah, actually, I mean, especially if we're looking at food culture, a space that's known for growing not food would be interesting to know, like, why. If you're on an island and you're living on subsistence and you can't bring food in as easily, and there's a bunch of space where things can grow and you're not using it for agriculture, like, that's a choice. It'd be interesting to know about that.
Yeah, I mean, inherently, I do find that if you are on an island, if you grow it, it becomes such a dominant part of your food. So, I'll say Hawaii, because I have this jar of Hawaiian peanut butter in front of me that I'm obsessed with this peanut butter. And now whenever, oh, by the way, I'm not sponsored by any, just because I do like wine influencer stuff. I'm not sponsored by any of these products I'm bringing up today. I just like these products. I pay my money on them. I want other people to buy them too, so they stay in business and I can continue buying from them. Just don't buy so much that I can't get anymore. But
Miroki has actually asked me to get in on going in on a group crate of this stuff because
yes.
she likes it so much, and I've said yes because I'm like, I trust your food taste. I will buy in on your peanut butter crate.
Yeah, basically, long and short is many years ago, I tasted this peanut butter in Hawaii, and they're called North Shore Goodies, and you can find them online. And I was so obsessed. It was so life-changing, the peanut butter for me, that I basically, whenever I knew anyone who was going to Hawaii, I would beg and plead for them to bring it back. But I now find out that they will ship like a crate, like a case of peanut butter for $15 anywhere in the States. Now I live in Canada, so that only helps marginally. Luckily, Eric's family's in the States. So I literally will like ask them to bring me the crates of peanut butter that I ship to their house, or I will personally go down and pick it up. So it is really delicious stuff. But what I was trying to bring up is that they what kind of makes their signature peanut butter is that they make a coconut peanut butter that is in a coconut macadamia nut peanut butter with honey that is absolutely astounding. And if you ever taste macadamia nuts from Hawaii, it is completely different than any other macadamia nut you can just buy in a supermarket. And it just sort of shows what, like, for, you know, when you're on an island like Hawaii, you will see macadamia nuts everywhere. You'll see coconuts everywhere. You'll see mango everywhere because those are their native fruits. And because they are an island, of course they ship things in, and you can, and, you know, obviously being a largely, you know, tourist driven economy, they do bring in a lot of foreign items, but there has been a large movement in Hawaii to kind of focus back on their more indigenous, you know, foods from what they fish and what they grow. And you'll see a lot of fruits and a lot of the food there. So when you're on an island, like we're discussing today, think like every single thing that grows or lives there, they matter because they contribute to your agriculture in some ways. And for anyone who really cares, pineapples is not a Hawaiian native thing. That came from the Dole plantation. It is a colonized food. So if we want to talk about decolonizing Hawaii, stop saying that pineapples are like a native Hawaiian fruit. Eat mangoes and coconut. All right.
Actually, I was going to quickly ask before we move on to the next card type. Are there any examples of flowers being used in dishes, whether it's like garnish, spice, or like a vegetable or in a salad that you're aware of, where you're like, oh, that's a cool way to feature a flower?
Zucchini blossom is probably one of the most common ones. You know, like a lot, you know, it's interesting because it is the flower that before it becomes the zucchini, and obviously that gets served as a main dish quite often. Flowers as a garnish is probably one of the most common things, getting edible flowers. Oftentimes there isn't like the largest focus on making flowers the star of the dish because most of the time, one, they're very hard. I think they are reasonably expensive to procure as well. So to try and make like a flower only salad or something would be the most expensive salad you've ever paid for, you know, to make sure that the petals are, you know, they have the integrity of the petals and that they're not like crushed all the time. You can't, you know, it's hard to, if you dress them up, the petals will end up becoming, you know, they become translucent. It's usually not a thing you bring in quantities. They often are a garnish to add a bit of lemonness and a little bit of pepperiness to a plate more than anything else. Interestingly, there is a movement now about superfluous garnishes too, though. So there is sometimes criticism for dishes that maybe have an edible flower garnish, but actually does not serve the purpose of the plate in any way, shape, or form. So it's something that a lot of chefs have become a little more conscientious of when it comes to, especially like in dishes like fine dining and stuff.
Gold, cough.
Yeah, like just, you know, I think fine dining is both, like, I think sometimes an aspirational thing that a lot of people want to experience once, but there's also a lot of criticism towards fine dining for being fine dining for the sake of fine dining, which is, I think, something we're trying to move away from as we look at sustainability in food and sustainability in supply chains. Yeah. So, yeah, I think flowers can be great, but like often, yeah, in dishes, like you wouldn't see in large quantities. Now, I see Essie here bringing it up in common, yeah, Middle Eastern, roses are a common Middle Eastern cuisine. So, and I guess that's the other thing we should mention about flowers too, is that they can be dried, obviously. Like, and I was thinking a little bit about Asian cuisine as I was going back about this, because this is the culture. We can get really deep into flowers. We can get deep into anything when it comes to food, guys. So don't get me going. And as you got me going. Middle Eastern cuisine. So I was thinking about dried flowers and how they're used, because they can be used at quantity, because at this point you're reaching the concept of preservation. And then you're looking at the concept of culture, because in North American cuisine, we're looking at fresh flowers oftentimes as garnish, and it's seen as a form of prestige. But if you go to a lot of places like Asia, Middle East, or areas where it's used as a commodity, you're going to see it dried, because under preservation, you obviously can make flavors, like make things last longer, even if they don't look as pristine. And then there's also flowers as a form of medicine. That's why I said I don't know whether the flowers will be used as medicine, because there's a lot of flowers that are used as medicine in teas or whatever for their healing properties. I mean, think about echinacea for one of them. So, but I want to keep the things going. So I'm going to move away from the flower rant.
We are. This rest of this session is going to be gluten free. There will be no flour in it.
Oh, ow! That one cut extra deep, because I am gluten intolerant too.
All right, so the next card type is the origin card. Origin cards either indicate something that is part of the origin of this location, or something that originated in this location. So we'll go ahead and draw that, and we'll see some prompts we could use.
So, was this island abandoned when mineral deposits ran out? Was it the site of an infamous duel? Was it created by the meeting of two cultures? Or is it the birthplace of a world religion?
And again, if you draw an origin card, so Miroki's going to make this choice for us, but if you're ever drawing an origin card, and again, you're trying to think about connections to food and food culture, like this card, there's so many things that are, the duel is one that, unless it's like an Iron Chef showdown, I don't have an idea for that, but meeting of two cultures, like you said, fusion cuisines that combine different ingredients or elements or styles from different cultures, phenomenal chance to look at food culture. Religion and food can be extraordinarily spiritual and can be part of spiritual systems. And then what was that last one?
Abandoned when mineral deposits ran out, which is also an interesting one, because it could be a place that could have been once exploited for a mineral, and now it could be a place that, like, maybe it was a place that was a great place for food, but is no longer a place for food, but they like need it because they don't have a choice, right? Maybe like the surrounding islands are running scarce. Maybe they were exploiting different things and they need to come back. The abandoned because of mineral deposits ran out is actually fascinating, because when I did a post on 9 Ounces Please to talk about Chef Shane, I did a draw as well, and I actually pulled a place that was known for salt, and the mining of salt is a thing. And if it's an island, it could be an island on an ocean, and like it could, maybe because of the way the way the currents were, this island was known for a really specific, like, miraculous mineral. Like maybe that mineral had healing properties, or it was something. So maybe it was not a place for food, but it had like it. If we're talking about fantasy, like, or maybe it was a mineral. Because sometimes food items, it's like, think about how people eat like activated charcoal these days, right? It's like, it's edible, but it also like cleanses your body. I make no claims about whether it actually cleanses your body or not. These are just the claims that people put in the health market, right? So it could just be a salt, and maybe it's just a tasty salt, but it's a salt that everyone believed could cure the incurable. So they exploited this mineral for a long time, to the point where there's none left, and then they abandoned it in search of seeing whether another island nearby could have that same mineral. And now they're like, maybe these islands are becoming more and more like decrepit and exploited, and people are, still seeking it, or like maybe they got closed off. Maybe it was abandoned on purpose. Like maybe they were like, maybe a larger governing body intervened and says, like the whole, if you want the earth to continue giving to us, like, you have to let go. And I know that probably wouldn't make the best room for a story, because a lot of stories about exploitation tends to want to drive the exploitation to the max.
But that can be the tension of like what happens next if that's happening. Like, there's people who are saying we need to be sustainable, we need to stop. There are people who are saying go, mine more. Like that can be a central conflict of the story. So I think that's definitely an interesting angle. The other thing that can be kind of fun is looking at how would either food culture or just like the realities of diet adapt to significant events in the past. So if the mineral deposits ran out a long time ago and like the island infrastructure falls apart a little bit, a lot of people leave, some people stay. What kind of meals do they start to do to adapt to the fact that like it's a different world on this island now? If they don't have as much trading power, are they eating flowers now because that was the thing that was left over that like hadn't been harvested yet that they could eat to get through a famine?
This might actually be an interesting one, and it's probably a good commentary about how, you know, a lot of Western cultures colonize a certain nation for their resources until they run out, and what happens when they run out. So if it was abandoned, maybe it was abandoned by the colonizers who came into the trade. It's like, oh, we're out of the mineral. Like they, you know, they came. So like, you know, like they came to this island. They met the native people, the native folks. And they decided that like, yeah, we're going to build houses. We're going to hire you. We're going to have work. We're going to build these mines. And they built all the mines and they took everything and then they left. And now this island is crumbling because they don't have the infrastructure in place to bring, you know, aid from the outside. And like, you know, there's no one coming in from the outside to help upkeep all these like fancy like cars and or like, you know, not cars. I mean, cars can exist in a fantasy world, but like carriages or like transportation or houses that they built. And they're like trying to find their way back to their roots again. And maybe they are extremely guarded from like outsiders ever coming again. So if you have a seafaring adventure, maybe this island is a place that like the main character lands on and he's meeting, and like, you know, maybe this person's really friendly, or maybe this person's been a benefactor of the minerals in the land that he's coming from, lands here and like never realized the kind of things that they're like that his people have done.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Okay, let's do the abandoned mineral thing because I think we've talked about it ad nauseum.
And I think is the two cultures. Oh, we can't corner check. Darn it.
We cannot.
Okay.
I mean, we're bringing in two cultures technically here. We're bringing in an outsider culture or a colonizing culture.
Yeah, it's trying to see if we can corner tuck to reflect that. But alas, they are poorly positioned.
It can have two cultures in our heads.
Yeah.
So the attribute card we have.
And what's an attribute card, Eric?
If the abandoned mine is the past, the attribute card is the present. Visit today. Will we find a place that is known for revelry? Does it have beautiful winters or summers? Is it known for tea? Or does it have a unique timekeeping system?
I almost like feel like I have to say known for tea, specifically because we were talking about flowers. It like almost is too good to be true. But give me the other ones again.
Beautiful winters or summers, or known for revelry. I'm guessing we're not doing the timekeeping system.
Yeah, I mean, if you measure time in like harvests or how long it takes to boil an egg units,
that is like you could.
I mean, this is gonna go back to that whole thing about again is like if I'm consulting on food culture in the world, I also am trying to build a world in which food has an element, but again, not everything has to be about the food either, right? I think I'm like almost deliberately picking the things that are food culture centric because we can discuss it that way. But maybe this is one of those moments I will let chat pick because chat might decide something that is more interesting and or challenging for me to kind of talk about how food plays an element to this particular attribute. So I'm going to hand this one over to chat.
So we have our four options are, we'll say summers, revelry, time, and tea. 3, 2, 1, go.
Because beautiful winters and summers could be a fascinating thing too, because maybe it is it's abandoned by colonizers, but maybe they still come and make it their vacation home. Like, I mean, I feel like since Hawaii is on my mind, I almost feel like I'm talking about Hawaii.
Well, and like beautiful, like it definitely has something to do with growing season in terms of like beautiful winters or summers.
Yeah.
I'm thinking
winter doesn't necessarily have to mean snow, right?
Yeah.
Like like the winter season just generally means that cooler season of the year. But for some countries and regions, that only just means still being like, I am now 15 degrees Celsius as opposed to 30 degrees Celsius. It's cold for someone, but it's not cold for, let's say, you know, my Toronto self.
It's actually an Australian winter. It's winter here, but it's beautiful there.
Yeah.
Are people saying tea?
Right now we're pretty evenly split between tea time and winter.
Tea time.
The votes have not been coming in fast today.
Tea time in winter.
Calvin already voted for tea, though, so I'm counting that as a vote for tea.
I mean, if you said tea time, then that could count as a vote for both time and tea.
We could.
Which gets us to 3.
That would give us 3 for time.
Messi did come in with time.
We'll say that time wins then.
Okay.
Like I said, the thing that we were like, oh, maybe it's not the thing we're going to discuss, is now a thing we are going to discuss.
Yeah. And if you're looking for opportunities to sort of connect non-food things on the attribute cards to food culture, some things you can look at are things like, if it's focused on, say, their architecture, like how would the layout of a home or a public building be set up to support preparing food, support storing food, support gathering for a meal? If like you have a prompt that's focused on etiquette, how does etiquette apply to mealtime, apply to the duties of hosting, of serving a meal? Like you talked a lot about sort of there are specific etiquettes around a Chinese meal or an Asian meal that could be very different from what you're expected to do in like a Western meal.
I mean, even something as simple as the concept of an egg timer. It's like, do you set like how long it takes to cook a thing? That is your unit of time.
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot of agricultural like places do care a lot more about time based on the environment as opposed to a traditional clock per se.
Right.
Okay. Advent card.
All right. Last card. The Advent card. A thing that is starting to happen that could shape the future of our little island. Or big island. I don't know. The sewers are overflowing with waste, people, or detritus. Detritivores, or the entire season's harvest could be wiped out by pests, weather, or sabotage.
I mean, I feel like the second one just has to be. I mean, I'm sure we could do very interesting things with the first one too, but the second one is coded towards food culture.
You don't want to go sewer diving?
I'm not going to go sewer diving this time. This poor region that I thought I was gonna like just be like, oh, and there's this place and they make this food has already been a place that we're like talking about colonization, exploitation. I'm not gonna make a sewer erupt on top of it too. I'm just gonna feel very depressed. I do not want to talk about dystopian world right now. The world's dystopian enough as it is for me currently.
So of our potential threats that could wipe out the harvest, are you particularly interested in pests, in weather, or in sabotage? Because those all play so differently.
Yeah. I'm not super interested in sabotage right now, mostly because, like I said, I was kind of starting to create a story about a person who ventures here. Like, it's like the naive traveler story, right? Like when the people travel and they believe things are like great, and then they show up somewhere and realize things aren't great, and it's an opportunity to kind of redeem redeem the actions of their people, right? And I was kind of leaning into that story. So like someone who might have been on the mainland, who was a benefactor of this mineral their entire lives, goes on and, goes and travels, and then they come upon this island and never quite realized, like maybe they were fed a lie. Like maybe, think about these things. Think about when like you buy like a salt and it's like, ew, it's like harvested from the sun, and then you don't realize that it's like from like a whole bunch of child labor or something. Or it's like, oh, the lovely silk. Like there's a lot of these stories out there where things look really, really shiny in the final product, but you don't think about, like, you know what? Actually, a really great example about that is coffee. Coffee is one of the most heavily exploited industries out there, where the customers often lose because we pay for a very premium product that really shouldn't be that premium. And the people who win are the middlemen, the brokers, and then the people who lose are the farmers in like Nicaragua, in Brazil, in Cuba, in Mexico, who are growing these and selling their beans at like pennies to the dollar to all these middlemen. Then it goes up and up, and then it's roasted, and then you put a package on. Tea's actually the same way. And then it's like this Nicaraguan tea with a dark roast with floral elements, and like it has the deep robust blah blah blah, and then you buy it for like $40 a bag. And you don't never think about where does it all come from and who's suffering, right? Like we think, oh, how nice, we bought this lovely tea. And I feel like someone could do that. Like there could be this person who's experienced their life like this, and they got this like mineral, and this mineral is talking about like how, comes from like this paradisical land, and they, it has this huge marketing story. And then they go and realize that their like entire foundation of what they believed in was a lie. And it's for them trying to like maybe take down the big man or break down this redeem their people's past, right? I think there's something really interesting there. So I don't want to necessarily say sabotage yet, but that's not to say that maybe like a colleague or maybe a friend or like someone who travels with them who wants to keep the status quo the same might sabotage something at some point. I almost want to lean into weather. And the way I would almost even position it is that it's not uncommon that this thing happens. Right. So it's coming. Because I think sometimes when we look at the Advent card in like for Deck of Worlds, is sometimes we look at it's like this like penultimate thing's gonna happen and it's gonna like change everything as we know it. But what if sometimes Advents are part of the ebb and flows of someone's life? Right? Like if you say a volcano is about to erupt in Iceland as an Advent card, they'll be like, yeah, it happens every few years. Right? They're not like, oh no, the like once in a lifetime volcano. So I think sometimes it's worth looking at the fact that like Advents just happen all the time. And how does that like affect?
I remember specifically when we were working on the events deck for Lore Master's deck, we came up with a prompt that was focused on a recurring or a cyclic, make this event recurring or cyclic, so people are used to it happening every so often. It was one of those things where I realized like, oh yeah, we always do kind of like this is the one to end all ones when it comes to events. We wanted a chance to really tap into that, like you said, the ebb and flow, the seasonal, and you can always choose to interpret an Advent that way for sure. I think that's a very interesting read.
Okay, so we've created this little micro setting. Now I'm trying to figure out what am I supposed to do to consult on this thing?
There's a couple more things that we can do. So one is I do want to get a culture key holes card out here so that we can think again about the culture of the world. Okay. And then I think what we'll do is pull some material and creature cards from Lore Master's deck as our ingredients, and then basically plan a meal based on this island.
I happen to have some right here already.
It's almost like we prepared. Let's do a culture keyholes to start, and then we'll pull some ingredients and we'll plan a meal and talk about what kind of scene we think the meal could be deployed in writings so that it'd actually be meaningful. Whether it's like the first meal this person has when they come to the island, or an emergency meal that's planned once the harvest is wiped out, or we can find different ways to plug the meal into the world and the story.
All right, I think we can work with this one. So we have, what materials do they see as precious? What 3 objects would you find in most homes? Who are their authority figures? And who or what lived in the land before them?
Okay, I'm gonna pull the card off the screen for a second because I'm a visual person and I need to like look at this. What materials do they see as precious? I feel like that's almost obvious. Who or what lived on the land before them? Who are their authority figures? What are 3 objects you would find in most homes? I like the 3 objects you would find in most homes.
Yeah, especially for cooking or serving food. That would be an interesting one.
That's what I like about it as well.
Cooking, serving food, but also I could be their timepiece, because they all because it maybe like I said, if weather is the thing that's going to affect at destroying their harvest, maybe they have things that are constantly checking, maybe they have storm readers, something that checks moisture levels in the air or wind levels, so that they can constantly be on the lookout for danger. I actually was even thinking about what might be a religious element or an element of worship that exists on their island, because I think sometimes when you are in a place that is so wild, and if people are really struggling, if it was abandoned by colonizers, if it was crumbling, maybe there's something higher than themselves that they believe in, because it kind of makes them feel safe, especially if their crops and harvest, I feel you would constantly want you're oh, ocean gods, please do not give us another hurricane, kind of thing. Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
So we've got, just to read, we've got a storm reader or storm watcher kind of device, and we've got a religious item for that would represent that kind of connection to the religion before colonization. And did we have was the third thing just gonna be a cooking implement, or do we have something more specific than that? I'm just curious.
We didn't talk about the third item, because I think I just threw a bunch of things out there. Yeah, but I think the storm, a storm reader is a really good one. A religious item is a really good one.
We could say a cooking item and then figure out what it is after we figure out what they're eating.
It's true. We could find out what their staples are. Someone said a pan made from the special minerals. Bronwyn said this.
Oh,
that's fascinating, because we were talking about this mineral as if the mineral was a taste commodity. My brain was thinking salt, right? So it's fascinating that there's this thing that is exploited, but it was used to mostly be made into tools, stone, or a cast iron or something. For them, the mineral was actually not used for consumption, or it was in a very kind of way of how it seasons, right? You make a cast iron, so you're consuming a little bit of the mineral over many uses, but you're not liberally just sprinkling it onto stuff.
I learned for the first time yesterday. A friend of mine who immigrated from Hong Kong when he was a kid was introduced me to Uncle Roger, the YouTuber.
Oh yes,
the character, the character of a YouTuber, Nigel Ng, who's Malaysian, and he as this character, Uncle Roger, reviews all sorts of different things, but often it's white chefs ruining Asian food, especially egg fried rice. But watching his videos where he reviews
Jamie Oliver,
Uncle
especially
Roger,
Jamie Oliver,
hate fried rice, Jamie Oliver. Why do you? Anyways,
he's very good at doing this character and those reviews, and but he's also featured some Asian chefs who do really interesting takes on egg fried rice and do it really well. And something I learned about from watching the channel was the idea of generational woks. So a wok that is passed down generation to generation as it continues to build this deep flavor. I think wok hei is the term for wok hei. Yeah.
Yeah. So hei means air, or it oh, how do I, almost I'm pretty sure the symbol for his wok hei, air, wok is the dish, the bowl, the cooking implement. But it's it means kind of air, but also can mean breath, the breath of the wok, the spirit, I guess, so to say. There's actually some really. So I interrupted your story, Peter, and I do want you to finish.
No, this is I want to hear about the actual thing behind this, so please.
There was actually a really interesting article written recently about how wok hei is dying as an art, and that there's basically not many chefs left around the world who have this kind of historical technique anymore, and that you can't really find it anymore. Whether it's just because it's such a labor-intensive thing because you cook through over really hot fire. It's a very physically laborious thing. It's very it requires a lot of manual handling. Maybe it's just like the culture of people not wanting to, do like cooking in that way anymore. But there was some really good articles about how that like style of cuisine is slowly, you're not going to find it as much anymore. And it was a very good article sort of about how this like, I can't remember if she was American Chinese or Canadian Chinese, but she basically went back to Hong Kong with her mom to try and like find some of these places that still existed that could still do it.
And so, so this is why I think this prompt with the pan made from a special material, and not only that, but if the pan is connected to a specific aspect of craft that is like knowledge-based, generational, cultural, and that would have been really threatened by the storyline that you've set up about there being a colonial power, especially if they've taken most of the mineral. They've probably also really diminished the knowledge base for how to work with it or what it means for food or food prep. I think that'd be a really cool way to tie together a bunch of the elements that we've been talking about today.
Yeah. Okay, let's do that. Thank you, Bronwyn, for that pitch.
Yeah. Well, pan is object number 3. And I also we forgot to introduce the Culture Keyholes expansion. It's an expansion for Deck of Worlds. It just features one type of card. Every single card has 4 different questions about the culture of your world. They're designed as very specific questions, so like little keyhole-sized questions, but they open these larger truths about your world. We started by just asking about 3 objects in the house. Now we know more about generational relationships. It connects to our understandings of colonialism. It connects to the food culture. So that's the goal of these questions: is small pointed questions that open up bigger truths.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe a really good way to describe talking about food cultures. Food cultures is just a million versions. Like all the things I was trying to talk about food today is all a culture keyhole. I obviously like you literally give me one little prompt about a thing, and I just went down this massive rabbit hole about the thing, right? Every little keyhole you offered me, I unlocked it and been like, all right, now let's talk about like, I don't know, tea. Now let's talk about wine. Let's talk about flowers. Like there's just, let's talk about food gathering or like intersectionality in culture. There's so many ways you can dive down. And food is obviously one of them. All right.
Awesome. Are we going to do a material first or a creature, you think?
I think let's pull a bunch of cards. So we've got like this is like the ingredients in the kitchen for Miroki. So we're gonna pull a bunch of creature cards and material cards from the Lore Masters deck, which if you haven't heard of it, Lore Masters deck is our deck of lore building prompts. You can actually assemble different card types to pull together different lore elements and combine them into an interwoven web. So there are cards for creating a figure, a character from your world. That character might be connected to a particular faction. You can pull a card to build the faction for your world. Once you build the faction, you might discover that they're in charge of a particular location in your world, which you can develop, which is tied to an event, which is tied to all these different things. And we're going to specifically pull cards for building creatures for your world and building materials for your world so that we have some ingredients to plan a meal scene around.
Is everyone here familiar with our deck so that we'll happily I guess repeat anything or explain it. Like if you're like, I am so confused about all these things and you need more clarification, let us know. If you guys are all like, guys, we've played with all the decks and you guys just go ahead and do your prompts, like we'll make sure we don't over explain ourselves as well. Because I know sometimes we get some newer folks here and we tend to get ahead of ourselves, but we also want to make sure that we don't like just keep explaining the decks again and again. If some of you Wyvern and Bronwyn, we've seen you around quite often, and thank you for joining our live streams all the time. I think I saw Tara here earlier too. Like some of you guys are long time community of the Story Engine, and so obviously you guys know more than anyone else how it probably all works. But I feel like we're almost approaching lore. This is what I kind of like about Lore Masters. This is probably how I noodle around the Lore Masters deck, honestly, is that I don't really tend to build lore clusters. I just kind of flip through things and I'm like, yay, this is fun. Let's just like throw some ingredients.
I'm just going to give you some cards and you tell me what ingredients appeal to you.
I get to just look at cards and look at ingredients. Slug, crab, kelp, owl. Owl would be hilarious because like no one ever cooks, like, at least like in our current society. I think if I said I cooked an owl for you, people would be mortally offended.
I know. Who cooks owl? Who?
It would like have the same, I think people would feel as uncomfortable as if I said like I cooked cat or something like that, right? And actually that was something we didn't discuss today, that and I don't like is what is considered normal in a culture, right?
Right. Specifically with like which animals and which organisms you eat and which ones are considered not to be eaten.
Yeah, like I think, you know, one that I know that is constantly contentious is horse. Horse being a pretty common French delicacy, and a lot of North Americans balk at the idea of eating horse. But yet many of us, like would never even blink if we talked about eating chickens or pigs. And why do we create ethics around that? And or even if there's like even if it's not ethical, maybe just uncomfortable. So like slug. And I'm actually tempted to use slug as one of the ingredients because there's a lot of Asian cultures that eat usually some form of sea slug or snail. And it's considered really delicious. I'm trying to remember, was it Ugly Delicious or one of the shows we were watching about food? And they were visiting, I don't want to say the name of I don't remember if it was Sri Lanka or the Philippines or Vietnam, but it was an area where like snails and slugs were the delicacy. Now,
I think it was Vietnam.
And now, mind you, like snails and slugs are a delicacy in a number of Asian cultures and probably even other cultures. But this episode very specifically focused on this one country. And when you watch it, if you're not used to it, it probably looks pretty unappealing to you. But like it's one of those things where you have to challenge yourselves, like, and what it means to kind of respect a culture, even if it seems like I guess like unattractive. Like for me, maybe a common one because I had it recently is jellyfish, because jellyfish is a cold appetizer dish for Chinese cuisine. So many of us probably don't have ethical reasons around eating jellyfish, but we might find it kind of weird. But why is it weird when I'm sure like there's. Like, I definitely have had Asian friends look at some North American foods and be like, that's weird, man. Like, I don't get it, right? And we all have to, I think there's like also like a respect that we should look at paying to food when we kind of explore food culture. Yeah, like I think Melville's saying French like snails, and I think there's a class element to it sometimes with how we present food. So why is eating snails and slugs considered like beneath people if you're looking at a bunch of Vietnamese people fishing them out in buckets and picking them out? Versus it being served with a pile of butter in like France in a bistro, right?
It sounds fancy when you say escargot.
I mean, it's interesting because like tea, like I'll go back to tea about this, right? Like tea is such a very common commodity. If you go for dim sum in like any Chinese restaurant, you just get served a pot of tea, and chances are the tea that you pay $15 for a bag is very similar to that tea you got served at the Chinese restaurant, but the packaging is just all different. Eric and I actually have this incredible floral tea that's from Fujian that we picked up at a tea house when we were hiking in Hong Kong in a fishing village. This tea is incredible, and I have like gifted this tea to several people in my life, and everyone says like this tea is incredible, and it would be a premium tea if it was put in a nice tin in the North American market. Like I said, a long time ago, I used to do a lot of tea tasting, kind of like studies of it. This tea would eat like as a whole leaf floral tea, if it was packaged and sold at 10 rens or a tea house, would easily be a $30 to $40 tin of tea. Easily. This cost me like less than $10 and it came to me in a Ziploc bag.
I don't even like tea that much, and this is the best tea I've ever had in my life.
Yeah, like I got the tea. Like I own a lot of tea, so I tend to not buy tea. I got the tea because he liked the tea, and I basically asked the restaurant. Anyways, so that's another thing about food culture. We're making some things with slugs.
Cool.
Okay. You can pick more than one if you'd want.
Yeah,
now we're full on.
Grab anything you want to put in the pot here. Grab it from those cards.
Because they're on an island, I'm gonna pick things that I think will fit the island, they're in a thicket, so we're gonna bring some shrubs. This will be some of the plants that they're gonna use, and maybe it'll like be used to like maybe create like flavoring, like the broth. And I'm also gonna pick snake, and the reason I'm gonna pick snake is because again they're near the ocean, and it's another one of those dishes that is very common in Asian cuisine. Snake soup is something that I actually do actively like getting when I'm in Hong Kong. It's actually considered like a bit medicinal. It's considered healing. Like people do eat snake for medical purposes in Ireland. Yeah, Ron went about lobster in Newfoundland, and it used to be prison food in the Maritimes, right?
My grandmother used to have stories about getting it for school lunch.
Yeah.
When she grew up in Maine.
So okay, what next? We are now going to.
I'm giving you a big stack of materials.
A big stack of materials.
Any of these that you want to, and the materials you can use both in the dish and also like as the materials for preparation or cooking implements or anything else that you'd like to be part of the food experience.
Okay, so I'm gonna pick bamboo.
Is it a bamboo thicket, perhaps?
It's gonna be a bamboo thicket, and I think like one again, since we're talking about creating something that is gonna be based a bit in Asia, and we're starting to build the world or the lore around this, right? Like we're going to qualify the thicket. If it's bamboo, it's interesting because bamboo grows incredibly fast. So I can't remember what was the statistics of how fast it grows. It's incredibly fast. It grows like 4 feet, like every couple of months. Like you're looking it up.
That could be tied to the timekeeping system. Maybe
it says up to 1.5 inches per hour.
35 inches a day.
That is
35 inches a day. So because I remember one of the things, I can't remember what documentary I was watching, but it was actually talking about bamboo as an invasive species and how like if not managed properly, it makes it really hard for some like people, like some areas to live. And how like why they have machetes in a lot of certain regions because they have to like hack bamboo down. They were showing how hard it is to actually hack like down bamboo. So yeah, like maybe one of the timekeeping elements is like critical moments where when you can like use bamboo before it becomes unusable because it becomes too big and too thick. It's very, very strong. So it could be used for all their building structures, and you like maybe they're using bamboo for almost everything because it is strong. So maybe it's used for building structures. Maybe they're used to kind of like scaffold, maybe the crumbling buildings. They're using it for cooking, for fishing. So, and it does impart flavor. Oh, I don't know.
Do you need more cards?
No. I like challenging. This is one thing I am of the person that tries not to turn it back a card, but I also think I also want to find some like limitations because obviously I see words like the vegetable is one of the ones
every material card has one thing that's pretty obviously an ingredient.
Yeah, it's very obviously ingredient, and I could use that, but I'm also trying to like just not make it so simple. Like meat's one of them, but actually, like it's like we already figured out what the meat is. We know it's snakes. We know it's slugs. We know it's going to be like shrubbery, and I actually feel like that it's not. I'm actually thinking that this as an island doesn't have too much like cattle or sheep, like kind of like farm animals, because they would be hard to raise on an island. Like what is there to eat per se, right? Like on an island where it's like very limited in what is growing. And if it was a place where it had like a really heavy mineral, there could be a chance that there wasn't as much grass. Or if you had animals, like you had cattle and sheep, would you be using them for milk as opposed to using them for like meat, right? When you could harvest like slugs and stuff. And again, this also speaks to the economic state of a place as well. So I'm kind of interested in paper. And the reason why I'm interested in paper is because, as you mentioned before, Peter, like paper can be used as a form of like preservation by wrapping things, or by like you can use it to smoke, you can use it to carry. And paper is also one of those elements I think a lot of people use for packaging when you don't have many resources in your hands. And you probably can make it out of bamboo as well. So
yeah. Or even like a rice paper for doing some kind of like roll or another kind of like pockety food.
It's like there's kind of like fish that are sometimes like steamed in parchment, things like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say, we've gone through an hour of world building an island, and we have not. This is the first time we talked about seafood was the slug, which is interesting. It was interesting that's kind of where our focus went. It's something that didn't occur to me until you said the sea slug, and I was like, oh right. And then again, snakes. There are water dwelling snakes. But that's just it's interesting.
I had it sort of on my mind, but it definitely was leaning towards fish at first, as opposed to until I was presented with slugs. And then, you know what, this is like one of those reasons why I do like I love playing with the deck for some ways, because again, it constantly challenges the assumptions we have when we world build. It's like, oh, an island, okay, well, like let's think about like fish, or we think about like maybe an island with tropical birds, or we, you know, but instead now I'm creating an island that is like a lot more based on like, again, and I know we talked about the Asian island, but when I was thinking about island, I definitely was leaning like into the tropical island. And then, yeah, I was thinking about things like fish, but then, you know, when I'm presented with these creature cards of like slug and snake, I'm like, oh, but like this is relevant too, right? This is actually, and I think, in my opinion, more informed than just saying, oh yeah, they go fishing. Because if you know, like the thing is whether, and if these people actually have been exploited and they don't have like the best economy, going fishing could be reasonably dangerous. Like unless you're fishing, like unless you're literally fishing on the beach. But again, like if you look at how a lot of nations, you know, like places with like in more impoverished countries or developing countries fish, they're not like, it's not a fishing rod. Like it's not a nice fishing rod. Like a lot of they freaking walk in the marshes with like a line on their hand. Like when I watch them, like when I watch these videos, I stress out because I just imagine like this wire just cutting into their hands as they're fishing, or sometimes they just freaking reach in and grab with their hands. So fishing is in some ways a luxury, and it's limited when you're fishing just like off the beach, right? You have to go reasonably deep to fish, and that could be dangerous if you don't have like you know, boats and stuff at your disposal. Whereas things like slugs and snails is almost closer to harvest. And if you have a thicket, maybe there's like a lot more like Martian, like water, like still waters that you can get things from. So this is like, you know, when it comes to like food culture, it's like informed world building. And maybe that's like one thing I would also challenge writers to think is like, when you guys think about the dishes that people are going to serve, like, does it actually accurately reflect the conditions of your world? Because you know, it's like the whole thing about believable world building in any respect, whether it is like the clothes that people wear, how people talk, how people, you know, character development or whatever, or like what they're traveling in. I would be a little bit hard pressed to believe that like if these people are, I don't know, in a like Scandinavian nation, that the average guy who's like traveling for some reason just like constantly has fresh fruit in his bag. Like that just wouldn't make sense to me, because in a nation that's like really, really cold and preservation is high, you would probably be very, very wealthy if somehow you had like an apple in your bag every single day.
There's actually a scene in one of the Game of Thrones books where some people are walking around in the north part of like the country, and they catch a duck. And one of the characters who's got a duck is like, hey, I had lemon duck once. It's like, can you make lemon duck? And the guy's like, where am I going to get a lemon in this part of the country, you absolute idiot? Said more rudely because it was Game of Thrones, but like, but it was like that was the whole joke. It was like, oh, I want lemon duck. And he's like, we're in the north. There's no lemons.
That's actually a really good little like touch of world building, because it probably shows like in that moment, highlights the ignorance of a character, or like clearly that they're not as well traveled, a particular naivety. It does a little bit of world building because it kind of reminds people that you're in a barren land that might not have fresh food. So I think like, again, it kind of shows sort of how like food can inform a lot about the social, political, economic space, about like the past and stuff like that. Okay, wait, I'm hearing this sad take. Mineral was used in religious ceremony, mined to extinction. The religious natives left. Those that stayed are in the commercial tea trade and island temple. Oh, no! Oh God!
I'll make it go away. This
back to the tide pools full of slugs.
You know, yeah. Let's go back to the fact that I was trying to build a redemption story here.
Yeah.
Redemption story.
Speaking of our redemption story, so if you want to pull any more ingredients, go ahead and grab those. But I was wondering, we have some ingredients. We have some aspects of the food world culture built out. We have the potential also for not just the ingredients you've drawn, but the flowers, the mineral, the cooking ingredient of the pan.
I'm going to toss a rock in there too, because rock can be used for heat.
Yeah. So with these ingredients in mind, if you were going to really focus on having one scene in this story about this person coming back to the island or coming to the island to see what it's like, who's the naive traveler, what is a scene in which you would want there to be food? And I think what kind of food would you want in that scene, and how would it connect to the world in the story?
You know, it's funny. I just had this moment of reflection when thinking about like the redemption story. And one thing it's a very common trope, right? When we have like the person discover that things are not all that they seem and they want to do right. But what I really don't want this is to become is like another white savior story.
Yeah, there's definitely that risk there.
There's a risk of a white savior story unless the main character is not white. So there's that, right? It could be like, you know, there's like, the thing is there, like, exploitation happens within Asian countries all the time, right? And that's important to note, that not everything is under the white patriarchy, and there is obviously a long history of struggle amongst different nations. Like China and Japan's tensions probably will never end because of what happened in World War II. And you know, Japan and Korea have a lot of struggle with each other. There is even sometimes, you know, there's inter-struggles with, like, within, you know, if you think about the caste systems in India, there's a lot of internal racism between mainland China and Hong Kong, especially in light of what has been happening in the last few years. These things do happen. Now, I think what I think is important though, is to sometimes recognize that I'm going to say this because I'm writing from the lens of a Canadian-born Chinese person. I live in North America. So living here, I don't know if I necessarily want to be telling a story that specifically deals with the internal struggles of my own people, or my own kind of, like, you know, race, broad scoping, right? Like Asian people, like the people of my kind of skin color, or people of my ethnic roots, versus talking about the struggles between and the tensions between a Western society and Eastern society. Because being born here, my narrative is wanting to talk about the struggles that probably exist, being a BIPOC person in a white and Eurocentric society. So I think it's important to bring that into light, because like the thing is and I hope I'm articulating this to the audience correctly, but the thing is like in Asia, there's definitely a lot more of that internal discussion going on, because those things matter to them and it's right in the forefront of the moment. Because I'm a Asian person living in a Western society, what my goal is I want to educate a Western society to know what it's like to be of a different, like a person born with with different skin color, a different appearance, how the kind of biases and oppressions that my people dealt with being immigrants into this country, and what racism like existed, right? So the redemption story I would personally want is to be centered around that. So I think I would want this character, this, that adventurer, to be white, and I want them to become immersed. And I believe that there is a good way to write a redemption story without saviorism involved, right? I don't know what that is yet. I think this is where, good writing and good like storytelling takes place. So when you're saying there's a time for them to cook a meal, and see, this is the interesting thing, because if this person arrives and they're met with hostility, then why would they be served a meal? And maybe him being served the meal is the first time that indicates any sort of acceptance that he has into this village or society, right? Maybe the first days he arrives on the island, like he's just, maybe they give him shelter because they're not like rude about it. Like it's not like that level of hostility. I don't want to ever create, just because a nation is developed or exploited doesn't necessarily mean that they're like, oh my God, the impoverished of the impoverished. And I think that's something we need to remember sometimes too. A country can be poor and still be stable and living a reasonable life. And that's something we even discovered being in Cuba. It's like people still have lives. And like, if you're not to say that there aren't stories where people are just like in such depths of poverty and exploitation that we're basically at the point of a humanitarian crisis. But I think this is not that story. Humanitarian crisis would be like a whole other story to develop. So what I would say is like almost like this guy comes and he maybe gave him some basic form of shelter, but he's not invited to like he's not invited to the family, like to the meals, the gatherings. Maybe this is like, this is a culture that, like, if this is an Asian culture, they could be a culture that does care about the unit. So there are family units and they gather and they cook for each other. Maybe someone like goes and harvests like slugs and snails every day and they share and sell to each other in the market, or maybe they cook it, like they boil it together on the beach and they enjoy kind of like a version of a clam bake, but he's never invited. And for him to like experience it for the first time is like the first kind of olive branch to say that he's like a part of them.
Interesting. Okay, so the first meal where he's like kind of invited into the hospitality space properly. Yeah, that'd be interesting. And I think there's so much you could do about what attention he brings to like the customs or expectations of the meal, and what like participation looks like for him. What is something like, there's so many ways you could do that through, again, there's different elements of like gathering culture and food culture.
And I think like this is another one where we can kind of just learn a lot about a character in the moment, right? Like, is he the kind of character, and it might not be just him. Remember, like I said that sabotage could be on the table. Maybe he came with one or two other people, and maybe that one person was his best friend who betrays him, right? Because he decides that he wants to live in the status quo. We see that a lot in things in movies like Treasure Planet per se. We see it in I don't think the storytelling's that good in this movie, but like Avatar. Not Avatar, the Airbender Avatar, the Blue People Avatar.
I'd also actually the very first live stream of the guest we did for the Story Engine Workshop series, which was 2 weeks ago, it was C.L. Clarke talking about building complex relationships and really dynamic, interesting relationships and romances. We talked about something that C.L. Clarke does really well in their work is have characters who have close relationships with people that represent different kind of ideological beliefs in the world and different conflicts in the world. And how do you maintain loyalty or friendship to people who cannot get along and one of them might just straight up be wrong? So again, maybe they have a close personal friendship with someone else who came with them who represents the worst impulses of colonialism or exploitation. And that person is willing to use every bit of closeness they have with this person to like stay close to them and to use them to get access to the culture. And you got a character who's now just stuck between those two forces and constantly being forced to make choices between the relationships that they're building with people who are from here and who like have a history of being exploited, and somebody to whom they have like maybe a lifelong connection and also a cultural connection, who represents those worst impulses and represents maybe the person that they don't want to be anymore. Like putting that character in the middle of those things could be really cool. And for more details on that, check out that live stream.
Yeah. I think the other thing what I was trying to say is like we can learn a lot about a character by how they respond to local customs. So does this person watch them make like slugs and snails and goes and reacts like, oh my God, that's disgusting, I will not eat this? Does this person feel uncertain and uncomfortable? You can kind of see it on their face, but they're kind of like, oh, I guess I will like eat the thing, or I will drink the drink, right? Because they want to integrate. Or are they someone who's just like, very openly curious, and they don't seem perturbed or uncomfortable at all at what they're being given, and they just approach it with open curiosity, right? Because all of this can define how the characters like immediately. And I think maybe the other question worth asking is like, is this person being invited to their home, or are they doing it, like I said, like a beach clam? So it's like, it's community, but it's not with full intimacy yet.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's like, this is your audition kind of, or this is your like first entry, and depending on how you do, you get more or less access. But yeah, I think that would be a really interesting meal to focus in on. And I think there's, like you said, culture keyhole moment. There's so many things we could open up about both cultures and about the relationships that play through a scene like that.
Yeah, and maybe I'll add one more little flavor. The other thing is like, because he's not really being openly welcomed, he's trying to figure out how to fend for himself in the early days. And there's, this is the trope that we see a lot too, right? Like the person trying to discover and learning the hard lessons, like trying to fish and failing, trying to hunt and failing, and trying to do this and failing. And that's an opportunity for them to like learn and integrate and appreciate what has to do with that particular culture as well. So, like like getting a snake, like fishing for a snake might be really hard for him because it could be like get out of their hands. Maybe he doesn't know how to butcher it properly. I think it's cutting eels specifically, but like if you've ever seen the butchering of eel in Japanese culture, right? Like they pin the head at the end of the cutting board with like a big knife, like a spike, and then they slice all along down the spine, right? But like otherwise, if you don't know how, like I think I've literally seen this on chef competition shows where they give you like the weird ingredient, and then they're like, how do I butcher this? And you see them struggling, and you're like, oh my god, this is a cutting accident waiting to happen. But this is like a way for them to kind of like learn and integrate in part of that. And that's like a big character arc development moment, right? And here's the thing, right? I know, like, I think the thing we should remind of, like, we were trying to talk about this from the lens of a movie. So obviously in the movie, we have a lot of opportunity to show. I think it could be a little bit challenging from a writing perspective, but from like, if you're playing D&D from a role-playing perspective or from a movie perspective, there's a lot of show. And like, these are really great montage moments when it comes to world building.
Yeah, definitely. The try and fail is like it pops on screen so well.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, we started off with absolutely nothing, and we ended up with an island with a rich history, where we see the intersection of cultural influence, the connections between food and religion, where we see coming changes, and we've ended up with a really interesting scene where we actually have like a unique dish that the culture is creating, and it has an important function in the plot. So these are all really interesting questions that you can ask yourself anytime that you're looking at how food and world building appear in your world. Also, I love this pitch. Maybe cuisine is very central to this culture, and possibly they periodically have intense cooking competitions. Perhaps this traveler enters the competition while seeking acceptance from the locals. I definitely don't want them to win it, but I would definitely be interested to see them try. But thank you all so much for coming out and joining us for this live stream. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and showing your experiences with food and culture. And thank you to our expert, Miroki Tong, for sharing her wide-ranging expertise in food and travel and culture and drink. You can find Miroki in many places on the internet besides the Story Engine.
In many places.
She is at 9 ounces please on Instagram, which is where you'll find, I think, the most frequent updates from your work on food and wine. But you can also listen to episodes of Tasting Together on Spotify, including a really wonderful episode that Miroki and her co-host Andre did with Chef Shane. If you'd like to just prepare your appetite for, hopefully we're able to get him back on in the future. Just some really fantastic questions. You'll see why she's such a gifted interviewer. Also, we don't have a banner for it, but I'm going to type it right this second. Can you tell us what Mahjong Witch is, Miroki?
Mahjong Witch is my opera metal music persona. So I'm an opera metal music singer on top of the other things I do. And I have 2 singles out on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you can download your music. You can just find me there and listen to it if listening to kind of listening to metal with a symphonic edge and an opera voice is your jam. So yeah. And before we wrap up, because I said I was going to do this, and I'm going to quickly throw at you a million culture keyholes and why I think it matters when developing your cuisines. So at the very, very beginning of the live stream, we talked about how we carry, like how we transport food and things in our daily lives. And one of the things that made me weird in school is because I always carried a little thermos, but I have a tin cat that is like a Singaporean tin cat. This is used to kind of carry snacks and dishes for, like, if you're in Asia. This one's from, like I said, Singapore, but I think a lot of other Asian cultures use this as well. Basically, you open it and then you have all these like little different compartments that you can carry like your snacks in and such. And I think that like that's, you know, obviously our version, like certain people's versions of a lunch pail, that also shows how like people choose to compartmentalize their food in certain cultures. Like this is how, you know, you're going to get like your meal, and you kind of structure your meals based on that. I had the Hawaiian peanut butter. This is Greek olive oil. And when I say Greek, I actually got it in Greece. And this actually transformed my understanding of olive oil immensely, because I learned that there's things like late harvest and early harvest olive oil, and not like olives from different trees, aged olives. This is one of those things where you go to a market, all of a sudden you just see like trays and trays and trays and trays and trays of olives, that your mind just like blows up when it talks about like how you, how even something as simple as olive oil can define your cuisine. For anyone who's really curious, if you ever go taste olive oil, don't put it on bread. You're supposed to taste olive oil straight from a spoon so that you can taste it in its actual form. We talked a lot about salt. This salt is from the Finger Lakes in upstate New York. They actually had a lot of history of salt mines in the Finger Lakes, which I actually didn't know a lot about, which makes sense because the lakes are literally carved out by glaciers, by massive glaciers over 10,000 years ago. So that's where you can find like, that's where you're thinking about like, oh, the history, like the geological history. It's like salt isn't just like this commodity that we get, table salt. Like it comes from somewhere. You have to mine it, and there's all these salt mines. So that's like something that even this is one of the things I love, finding very simple items like table salt and understanding it in a much more in-depth level. Chili oil, like a Szechuan chili oil from Taiwan. This business actually was like hailed by like the Institute of Taste in Belgium. They got certified because of their work in chili oil. This is when you learn the difference between different spices. It's like, it's not just spicy food, right? Like chili is not the same as Szechuan, and it's not the same as habanero. It's not the same as like Scotch bonnet, and how different spices are interpreted by different countries is different. One thing Eric and I learned is that Eric handles a vinegar-based spice a lot more than I can, because I never grew up with vinegar-based spice all that much. I grew up with a lot of oil-based spice, which is, you know, predominant in Chile and Szechuan, and a lot of like Szechuan cuisine. I was like chili cuisine. It's not chili cuisine, it's Szechuan cuisine. Whereas a lot of Mexican flavors are based off like vinegars, like habanero. That's really important when defining cuisine. You can't just like blanket throw words like spice in. Beer. So, you know, since a lot of us talk about taverns and fantasy, like, you know, I did think about this one. Everyone's like, bartender, give me your best ale. And I'm like, you know, ale and lager are different things. Why does no one run and say, give me your best lager? Why is it always your best ale? I'm curious about that. Like, I think sometimes people who are food experts probably, like, it's like people who are like experts in anything. You get really worked up when you see like short-sightedness. So I said, you don't have to dive too deep into the world, but maybe dive a little bit into the world. The thing that drives me insane, I still don't understand it to this day. Even the most high-budget movies, they can't seem to get the color of wine right. I don't get it. I really don't get it. Or like people just like make the most nonsense things about wine. And I'm like, why do you, like, it takes so little to learn a little bit about it. But the reason why I say this about beer is because people who love fantasy writers and talking about beer can define a lot about where your characters are traveling to. Why? This is a beer from Hong Kong, and what was really interesting is because beers, they do so much infusions and flavors these days, right? Now where I was like, it's like, oh, this beer has been infused by like cacao, and then it's been infused by like cherries. This is actually was aged in like I believe it was like a soy sauce vessel. So you're not really going to see that in places other than Asia, because, you know, they're going to use things like jasmine, going to use things like matcha, you're going to use things like soy sauce, because those are the things that influence their craftsmanship. So if you are, you know, if your characters like drinking beer, you can always like define this a lot in your travels. Things like rum, right? Like I got this from Cuba. One of the things I want to talk about, like a little bit about, is like how government has an impact on business. So you know, we talk about rum, and rum sound is like delicious and all that, but rum is completely controlled by the Cuban government in Cuba. So in what places maybe food ends up being like an item that only exists for the rich and the wealthy or for foreigners, and you know, it goes back to this in like where it's like something that the locals maybe never see, and that's something we actually see a lot of, right? Like we took like some of the, like I think a lot of the best like Brazilian coffees and stuff is all exported, and you never see it internally. I talk, you know, quinoa as a food is actually one of the most exploited foods out there. So this is me getting on my soapbox again. Don't really eat quinoa if you don't have to, because it was like a staple food for people, for folks in Peru for a long time and a lot of South America. And then they exported it all, and now locals can't afford it anymore, but it was a food staple for them. So, you know, like food responsibility, I think, is an important thing to explore when developing a culture and when you're examining things like classism in a world. So, okay, I will stop there, but I hope that gives everyone a little bit of inspiration when it comes to taking things away and seeing how even the most like innocuous of items can actually reveal a lot of possibilities in their storytelling.
That was super cool. Like getting to take a tour of the world and also a, like I said, culture keyhole peep into a bunch of different aspects of connections between food and drink and culture. Super, super, super fun. Yeah, and so again, thank you to our special guest, Miroki Tong. Thank you to everyone in the chat. If you have any additional questions, we are at Story Engine Deck. If you have any questions about food and world building, we will pass those on to Miroki if you didn't get a chance to ask during the chat. But otherwise, this was such a cool and deep exploration. And thank you to everyone for contributing. And we'll see you next Thursday
week
at 3 p.m. Eastern. We are doing these live streams weekly, and we have 2 more left with guests, and then we'll be doing a recap live stream. And that will be with Diana of the Rose. Diana Fay, the actual play performer, dungeon master, writer, is going to come talk to us about player-driven world building, how to build worlds that are really focused on your players' needs, perhaps even collaboratively with them, and that your players will really be in love with because of that work and attention to detail that you put in. So we're really excited to chat about that with you all in 1 week. Otherwise, goodbye for now, and thank you so much for tuning in. Bye-bye, everybody.
Know where your food comes from.